November. Okay, this is November meeting of the Hood River Watershed Group. It's the November presentation. So thanks everybody. Just as in the past, we'll kind of do our same thing in case people don't remember. That is, first we read the mission of the Hood River Watershed Group, which is to sustain and improve the Hood River Watershed through education, cooperation, and stewardship. So that's what we're doing, and do appreciate everyone coming, and we will introduce ourselves around the room. So I'm Chuck Gailing. I am actually, I guess, the president of the board of directors at this point in time and chair of the watershed group. So we'll go around and I'll just sort of point this out. You can introduce yourselves. Go ahead.
I'm Larry Teeter, and I've just been volunteering with Alex over the summer on various projects and came out for a couple of the demonstrations also. I live in Portland, and I'm an epidemiologist by by training, and so this is a different side of me. That I became acquainted with the watershed group through the OSU Master Naturalist program, which I just completed.
Cindy Beeman, director for the watershed group.
I'm Jim Brick. I'm with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I work out of Clackamas, and I'm the Lower Columbia River Conservation and Recovery Plan Implementation Coordinator.
I wonder what that acronym is.
Frank Akamura, board chair of the Conservation District in East Fork local archery district. Also participation in development of the plan. Long time ago.
Megan Saunders, I'm the project manager for Farmers Irrigation District. I'm Lindsay Powell with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm the assistant district biologist in the Dalles.
I'm Hillary Delos with Oregon Fish and Wildlife, and I'm a conservation liaison with NRCS, which basically just means I'm a partner biologist.
I'm Jackie Pribble, and I'm just a fisher girl with him.
I'm Steve Pribble, local fisherman. My name's Dan Pierce. I'm a river steward for the Native Fish Society. I live here in Parkville.
Greg Short, board member, locally. Hopefully you've heard enough from me already.
Heather Henderson, the district manager at the Salmon and Water Conservation District. Lillian Dick, in terms of Orange.
Ryan Gerstenberger, board member and fish biologist for the Yakima tribe, but until recently with the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs and the River.
Gary Asbridge, Upper Valley resident, longtime watershed group member.
Okay, and then Alex is on there, and I think Judy is on there. You guys want to pipe in?
Hi, I'm Alex Danielson. I am the Watershed Group Restoration and Outreach Project Manager and lousy tech support.
Hi, this is Judy Fiedler, and I am a board member and a Mount Hood National Forest Fish and Wildlife biologist.
And is Les still here?
Probably.
Nope, he's a goner.
Okay. All right. So we are ready for our presentation. And Cindy, are you going to introduce Jim? Or
Wow, I'm so out of practice. Jim sort of introduced himself with the, I don't know, there's no way I can repeat your title.
There's no need to.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim, for coming. Jim agreed to give us an update on where things are at with population recovery and also habitat restoration, just sort of the whole shebang as it relates to the Lower Columbia Conservation Recovery Plan. And how long have you been, you sent me your bio, and I apologize, that is.
That's kind of irrelevant. I've been in this position for probably, I think, 6 or 7 years now. And I've been with ODFW for 26. Got the gray hair going. And
Yeah, you've been around the fish flock.
yes, I have been. I've been in fisheries for a long time. But anyway, so I guess we'll.
I'll forward it for you. I will forward slides for you.
All right, sounds great. So as Brian said, he was part of the crew that helped form this plan. This plan was really worked on probably what, 2007, 2008, and was approved in 2010. And the plan directs us at a 12-year interval to come in and do a more of a comprehensive assessment. I produced a yearly report that really is very small. It's more referred to as a report card, but this is our first effort at producing a 12-year assessment, a comprehensive assessment of the entire plan. This is a portion of that that's only in the draft stage right now. But this is an evaluation of what they call viable sum amount of population metrics that are in the plan. There is evaluation criteria that we look at to kind of give us an idea of where we are in association where we think we should be. And it gives us an opportunity to do kind of a more thorough look on where we are in recovery. And so the plan goes beyond this report that we're going to be doing, goes beyond this evaluation of VSP metrics. We're looking at our chum recovery strategy, predation narratives, and a number of other, we're doing climate change analysis and some habitat change analysis. And some of those are still in the works. And we hope to have this out the first stage is once we've put it all together, we're going to meet internally and have those discussions with our various programs. And then we're going to go out to the public and have these discussions. And then we'll ultimately go to our Fish Commission for final approval. And we're trying to target midsummer, but we'll see how that goes. There's one real wild card. I'm not going to discuss that today, but it has to do with what we're going to do with our Chinook populations, which are kind of non-existent almost across the board. But anyway, so I'll start this discussion. And so the way NIMS kind of looks at delisting is kind of how this chapter or section of the report will go. And so this is looking at the abundance and productivity, spatial structure, and diversity of the fish. And then the listing factor criteria are those threats that kind of put us where we are with our fish populations. And so these were all metrics that were put together before I got here, and this is kind of how we're working on our draft right now. And so you'll also notice that you probably won't notice, but many of the diversity metrics are also listing factor criteria, and I'll discuss those when we get to them. Now, I have to tell you, I got to talk a little bit about the evaluation criteria so you understand where I'm coming from. So I got like 3 or 4 slides that are going to be some words, but then we'll get into some of the meat of the discussion. So if we can advance to the next slide. So the abundance and productivity metric, it's basically 2 attributes, and they basically ran some information and created an estimate on abundance and an estimate on productivity and what we would need in terms of adults to meet the productivity that we need under our delisting scenario in the recovery plan. And so they squeeze those 2 together, and it's expressed in abundance estimate. And the first step they used was this Beaverton-Holt recruitment model to get an estimate of what the return should be over a 100-year time frame. That's an average over a 100-year time frame. But the goal of the recovery plan was to perform a more comprehensive assessment in a shorter time frame. So they used the information that they got from these stock recruitment curves, and we moved into, they created another, trying to think of the word. They created another function there that they use, or another, not a recruitment curve, but equation, and they use things with an index of climate in it, because climate ultimately affects our populations on the short-term scale and the long-term, but they use this to evaluate the short-term scale. And so for most of our salmon populations, it has to do with the PDO, and our steelhead populations, they use the flow in the Columbia River. And then ultimately, once they figured out what the number should be for abundance and productivity, they stabbed an extra 20% on it to accommodate for future climate change. You have to remember this was done in 2008, so that we knew about climate change, but we didn't know as much as we know today. So that you'll see that reflected in the yearly goals. And so what it comes down to is we look at each population and we determine whether they pass or not pass, and that just gives us a flavor for how we're doing. Each year they produce an abundance number based upon this recruitment curve and these other factors entered into it. And they ask, is the actual abundance above or below that time frame? And over a 6-year period, is it above that number or below that number over time? And if it's below the number, then there's a potential to talk about adaptive management. We don't know if we're going to go there yet, because if we open up, depending on what we want to adaptively manage, if we open up this, the whole plan to adaptive management, it is also written, it's a federal plan, and the federal plan has appendices with the Oregon and Washington plans in there, because the lower Columbia River area covers both states. And so there was negotiations under our delisting scenario. So there's a lot of questions, how much we're going to adaptively manage at this stage. And we'll have to engage with discussions with the feds and with Washington. Next slide. The next one was spatial structure. And I have to tell you that we do this with live sightings. On the spawning ground, we don't do it with red counts. So the only information we'll have on spatial structure is with coho. And you can see the delisting goal for all the populations in the Hood River. And so they're all really low, and there's a high burden placed on Hood River fish. And that has to do with the way NIMS delists fish and the very low number of populations on both the Oregon and Washington side of the river, in which they can come up with the overall medium to low risk factor across all populations. And so the occupancy threshold says for these populations, this is what they have to survey. But again, we only have coho here. And so what we do is we look at each year where 80% of the sites that were surveyed, were they occupied with fish or not. Next slide. This is another one I talked with some folks in this room about. And again, you can see the burden that's placed on Hood River fish. This is a 9-year average. And what we look at is what is the percent of hatchery fish on the spawning ground over a 9-year period. Next slide.
A quick question. What did you mean by the burden is on Hood River fish?
So there's a heavy burden placed on Hood River fish because when NIMS goes through their delisting criteria, they look at the entire lower Columbia River, but then they portion it down to the strata. And in each strata, you have to have at least 2 populations that meet a low risk of extinction. And so I don't know the number of populations that are on the Washington side, but on the Oregon side, depending on which fish runner species we're talking about, it's either 1 or 2. And one of those, and those being the lower gorge and upper gorge, which you have almost no spawning habitat. They have very little spawning habitat available to them. And so there's not a lot that you can do towards recovering fish in an area where there's very little habitat for fish.
Okay, makes sense.
And so that's why there's a higher burden placed on Hood River fish than some of the surrounding populations. And the harvest metric, I'll mention the coho first, because this one's actually going to be pretty easy, because this, even though coho are for Hood River populations of coho, they're not subject to this pass-fail piece. And they look at, and the reason they did that has to do more with, again, the burden that's placed on them. And what they end up saying is that realistically, depending, so each year NOAA looks at the parental escapement and marine survival rate, and they pick a bin for ocean and Columbia River fisheries, depending on which one it is. And what they're saying, the recovery plan stated, was that we shouldn't even be fishing this high on those fish. It should be 20% less than that. And that's why they never subject the Hood River population of coho to this. But I just put it in there so folks can have an understanding of what those are. And then on the other side, you can see this spring Chinook is 25% overall harvest impacts. And then your steelhead populations are subject to a 15% impact, and we evaluate that over a 9-year period and create an over a 12-year period and make an average. Next slide. Okay, so 2 more slides. These 2 go together, and then we'll get into the meat of this. This is about restoration metrics, and so this is a listing factor about destruction of habitat, and there's like 3 or 4 of them in there we're looking at, and this is one that I brought information on. And so in the recovery plan, there is a big table in there, and it has huge numbers of restoration that needs to be accomplished, and it's not unique to the Hood, it's all across the basin. And what I did originally is looked at that, and I thought folks were going to look at that and have some sticker shock and say this is not possible. And so the recovery plan looks at it, and like I said, they have goals of delisting in broad sense. In the recovery plan, the goals for habitat restoration were expressed as broad sense recovery. And so now we're talking about goals of, we have so many fish that there's enough fish for everybody. So what I did is I tweaked the numbers in the spreadsheet to reflect this low extinction risk. And so what you're looking at here is summer steelhead in the Hood and with how they went about doing this. But they also said that in order to get to a low extinction risk, we had to have about 85% improvement in habitat. And that is, and the planning team didn't think that was even possible because of constraints, whether it's the dam or other issues. And so what I ultimately did is, instead of doing the gap between here and here as what's in the recovery plan, I actually did the gap between these 2. And instead of making an 85% improvement, we're looking at a 30% improvement as a first step to getting us there and providing more realistic expectations on what we could achieve, at least in the 15-year term that the recovery plan asks. So I modified this next table you'll see on what we think we should be doing for recovery as a first step. And so these are based upon the modification from the plan on either the delisting scenario or under the most feasible scenario. And you can see the numbers here, and they also utilize these type of metrics because these are how we measure aquatic habitat inventories. And so what they did is they looked at what the condition of the habitat was and how much of it needed to be moved into to either from low to medium or medium to high categories. And these are the numbers that we have. So 33 miles of large wood, 20 miles of side channel. And you can see, like maybe in Young's Bay, the reason those are so low is because the populations there are left at a very high risk of extinction. You can do that once you get the overall extinction risk for all the populations. To meet the moderate low, you can have some in medium, some in high. And we have our state fisheries, which are commercial fisheries down in Young's Bay and Big Creek. So you'll not see very many miles on those. And another example on Clatskanie, this is a high burden population. But when the planning team met, the folks said there's no way we're going to get any side channel work done here. And so they actually increased the miles on the large wood. And so there's some give and take in this. And also recognize that you guys do a lot of good work on water conservation. And so ultimately it comes to the fish response, but this was kind of a good target to give folks to start looking at that. And the metric is if we're looking at 11 years, when we see the results on this, we're looking at 11 years, which is about 75% or so, or 78.
Quick question. On that last slide, what were the 2 things that you took out to get to feasibility instead of?
The 2 things so the plan has a list of metrics for how many restoration actions should occur in terms of mileage. And that is under the broad sense recovery goal. I changed it, and it's still in the plan the same way, but I created new targets and I removed, instead of going to broad sense recovery, I removed it to the delisting scenario. And then I further reduced that where the planning team says, there's no way we can get to that. And so these are just interim targets that are more realistic than trying to go for the broad sense.
And which ones came out from the broad sense?
None of them are in the broad sense right now. And if you want, I can always discuss that later with
I was
you.
just wondering the highlighting. You said you went from the top down.
Oh, yeah, so this highlight is where we said under the delisting scenario, said where we go, and the planning team says this is all the further we think we can get it.
Okay.
And so, like I said, I modified the volume of work that needed to be done in the interim to give folks a more realistic target, and then we'll see how the fish responds and change those as we get, the volumes up there in terms of where we need to go.
And just to interject, these, sort of the target figures that Jim arrived at for the Hood River Basin and the rest, I took the Hood River Basin targets and incorporated that into our strategic action plan. So when you look at that Hood line, 33 miles of large wood placed, 20 miles of side channel increase, 19 miles of riparian planting, not so much the off. I don't think we've done the off-channel wetland complex tracking in this basin that I'm aware of. But so though, there has been progress on all of those habitat restoration types. And so in the action plan, we note how much has been accomplished as of the date of the plan and what our target is for the 20-year action plan to achieve these targets that are listed here. So just to kind of connect that to our action plan.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We did the same thing in the Clackamas, and that we felt that was a very good positive that we still had when we were going forward a FIP in that range. All right, now we're actually into some slides. So here's some of the results of some across both at the Lower Columbia River population level and at the Hood River level. And so up here in this corner, you see our spring Chinook, and there's only two populations of spring Chinook on the Oregon side of the river in the Lower Columbia River. That's the Sandy and the Hood. A lot of folks sometimes think the Clackamas is in there too, but that's actually an upper Willamette stock. It's defined by NIPS. And so what you can see here on this purple line is what I did is I added the goals, the 100-year average that we felt we needed for both the Sandy and the Hood, and created this line right here. And so what we think is we need around 3,000 fish to satisfy the delisting goal, although NIMS delisting process requires other things too. But you can see that for spring Chinook, we're actually doing pretty good under the delisting goal across the entire Lower Columbia. And down here in the corner, you can see the Sandy is increasing fairly good over the years. And actually they had a year when it went above the broad sense goal for that basin. Now over here on the far side, you can see the Hood River, and this is native origin fish. And so we've had low numbers. And I think one other thing I would tell you all is that almost all of this information that I'm presenting to you on the Hood River comes from the Hood River production program. And so that's another important point when you're contemplating and discussing monitoring, especially if there are reductions in monitoring effort as a result of reshuffling dollars around. But so when I was telling you about the yearly goals, you can see, oops, I'm going to triple this. The yearly goals, these yellow lines are the abundance goals, and the blue lines are the actual abundances. And so you can see over here, and this is probably not a surprise to anybody on natural origin returns, they have 5 years worth of goals, and each year was well below the goals. Next slide. And then
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Is the abundance goal going down because of conditions? For that
There, yeah, the abundance goals go down on a yearly basis and it has to do with the amount of brood that goes out in previous years
Oh.
and the climate condition. And so it's more of a reflection of if you had populations that were functioning fairly well and still realize that you had so many fish going out and what the climate conditions were, that's how that's reflected. And, okay. So here you're looking at the spring Chinook stray rate. We recognize this is not a listed population, but the recovery plan still has goals. And again, the stray rate, you know, the average should be around 10%, and it's running higher than that. And so if you, right now, okay, so there is enough to determine that we didn't meet that metric.
Well, just, is that stray rate or is that, it says PHOS,
That's PHOS.
per percent hatchery origin spawner, which is, stray rate kind of implies that it's from another basin to me, so
Well,
is that correct to, or you know?
it's percent hatchery fish found on the spawning ground,
Yeah.
whether they're come from outside or from whatever program. It's looked at very, how do I explain it? It's basically what they see when they're out there counting or what is found at the hatch or at the weirs that you guys run.
Yeah.
Now, we could talk about, well, I don't know if we want to get into NLI and some of that other stuff, but I understand where you're coming from. That's why I kind of talk.
Yeah, I know in
we've
the
talked
business,
before.
it's like strays, you're usually worried about Deschutes fish or, you know, lambfish or something coming in.
But you're saying a stray is any fish that isn't. You're saying the hatchery fish is.
A hatchery fish without a adipose fin is counted as a hatchery fish, and that's how this is determined.
And that's determined as a stray, whether or not it was a hatchery fish from this program, correct?
And the other caveat there, sorry, to interject
okay.
too much, but the Hood spring Chinook actually went extinct and they were reintroduced with hatchery fish, so they're supposed to spawn in the wild. You know, that's our management, has been to allow hatchery fish to spawn, to
Yes.
found a population because there was none, so.
Yeah, that's
It
why.
shouldn't be alarming, I guess.
Yeah,
To have a
that's,
lot of
I agree with you, and that's why I kind of said, we recognize that it's not a listed fish species, and they were founded on the Deschutes stock, and so we recognize that, and you know, just because something is above or below a line, it doesn't mean anything's going to radically change. Although we did see that with the Steelhead program, I wasn't really privy to those discussions, but we know things can change, but I certainly wouldn't be worried about this one in particular.
Can you explain in 2020, the blue, you know, the stray percent goes way down is? Yeah.
There was no fish.
Okay.
We had a
That's what I
really
thought,
poor run,
but
yeah. It was a very low run of hatchery fish. So probably the lowest we'd had in like 15 years.
Can you put the same amount in that year?
That similar, we actually increased production recently. But I don't think those production increases would have kicked in for that 2020 return year, which would have been like 2016 brood year. And then all over the basin, that was a weak spring Chinook right here. That was a down year.
Do you know yet what the straight, you know, sort of the hatchery percent was for the returns this year?
I don't know. Well, so what I recall, and this is kind of napkin numbers here.
Yeah, right.
That 2020 run year was probably, you know, I want to say it was like 350 adult hatchery spring Chinook. And so like last year, after things had really recovered, you know, like I said, we had a record. So we went from one of our worst runs of spring Chinook to one of our best runs, probably our best run ever in 2 years. And so we probably had 2,500, you know, spring Chinook. So you're talking like hundreds to thousands, you know, different.
Yeah, and I thought that there was also like a pretty large, what Megan was saying is a pretty large percentage of what you guys saw this year returning were wild, you know, like, you know.
Well, percentage
natural
wise, it's
origin.
probably so, you know, that year when there was hardly any hatchery fish, that was also the same ocean conditions affected the wilds. And so, you
Yeah.
know, maybe you had 50 or 70 wild spawners and 350 hatchery fish. And we had this 2,500 fish run, and maybe there was 300 wild fish. So it was like at a similar scale, you know what I mean? It's like it kind of-
Proportionate, okay. I
you
didn't
know,
know if there
the
was-
tide raised the boats the same amount,
Okay.
if you will.
Yeah, that was my
Um,
question.
It's just one boat's smaller than the other.
Yep.
For 2021, that the PHOS will certainly be above 80%. Just on that figure, it will rebound to above that orange trend line.
Okay. Ready to go next?
So the other one over here is harvest impacts. And like I said, you can have 25% total harvest. And so this is ocean harvest here on this first column. That's produced by the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. Obviously it runs about 4 years later than what, it's not real time. It takes a long time to get all the samples in from the various fisheries. This covers everything from Alaska through Canada on down to the Oregon coast or through the Columbia River. And then we have this Columbia River impact rate. And it's the same every year just because our folks at our Columbia River Management put that together for us. Hood River impact rates on Chinook come from our sports tags that are turned in. And then we have this wild card, it's kind of missing, and I talked to our staff about this, and that one's a real tough one because the fishery that occurs and how it's reported is reported across the entire zone, and we would be looking at if there was any impacts between the mouth of Hood River and Bonneville Dam. And so I was told you'd have to look at boat positions and do this, and so we haven't. Nobody's from our department says we need to get that number from me yet, and so that number has not been produced. And you see that is common across all of the species that we're looking at, except for steelhead, where there's really almost no impact at all. And so in the end, you add all these numbers up, and for almost every year except for this year, it's pretty. I'm guessing this impact is probably going to be closer to here. I don't think that's a concern on any year in the evaluation criteria. You can exceed that, it's an average on this one of are you less than 25% over a 12-year period? We don't have enough data yet, and so that's what these boxes reflect here. We didn't meet our abundance and productivity metric with PHOS, and then harvest is unknown because we don't even have enough years of data, even if we had those question marks filled. And so
these percentages, is it percent of the contribution to mortality? Is it
the impact rate would be harvest plus incidental mortality. And so there's some discussion on what numbers it should be used, and it varies, I think, depending on whether you're in a commercial gillnet fishery or a sport fishery. But I think the average we use is 10% on between direct harvest. We have direct harvest, and then there's a 10% incidental mortality for these fishes that we use. Okay, next slide. Now we'll go into steelhead. See a better picture. So over here in the corner is the steelhead for the entire Lower Columbia River area. And that does not include the coastal strata because they're considered Southwest Washington fish. And you can see that this is the kind of the delisting goal if you add them all up, and we're significantly below that. And over here you have the Hood River fish, and you actually met the abundance of productivity goal of being above this line. You can see that you're running about 500 fish, and it's pretty much staying steady, with some years better and some years worse. The Clackamas is not faring any better because this is Lower Columbia stock. But the Sandy is kind of an enigma because that one there's some fluctuation there, but they are increasing and doing rather well. And so again, for these here, you have your abundance goals in orange and your observe abundance in blue. And you can count the numbers there and see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the criteria is to meet it 6 years out of 12. And so the answer on that one is yes. Next slide. And then here is your percent hatchery fish on the spawning ground, as measured by the Hood River Production Program. And you know, we want to see it at the 10% level, and it's not there. And so you can see where you hit the abundance and productivity metric, but not the PHOS. And then again, you can see where we calculated the impact rate for harvest, and that is basically Columbia River and Hood River.
You don't have a graph for summer steelhead on Hood River?
I do have a graph for summer steelhead.
Coming up?
Yeah, okay.
I'll shut up.
There it is. And so, you know, I mean, again, the summer steelhead low is really low numbers. They haven't produced the abundance goals that we need to. So our staff out of Corvallis Research produces these abundance goals. And so I don't have a lot to say other than we have low harvest on summer steelhead. And this is the only population in the entire lower Columbia is in the Hood. They have been sandy and clackamas, but they're not native. And then I wouldn't worry about stray rate over here. Again, it's a 9-year average, and even though it's not attained, you're pretty much running the 0% stray rate over the last, since 2015. It's pretty much where it is. You had, when you calculate the 9-year average, you go back to 2010. That's what's kind of throwing it up. But it's looking good on the harvest. It's looking good on the hatchery stray rate. Just got to figure out how to start returning steelhead across the entire lower Columbia, except for the sandy. Next slide. And here's coho. This is one where we have the most information for the most part. And again, here is would be the goal for the entire lower Columbia, all the Columbia River populations. And you know, we've went from back in 2002 to about 5,000 to just over double that in 20 years. Things are been looking good. The only piece that kind of is confounding a little bit is when you look at the coastal strata and the gorge strata, which the Hood is in, both of those are kind of in a downward trajectory. But the coastal strata is actually kind of buoying the coho population, because we're getting a run of might be 14,000 this year in the clackamas. It's been up to above 10,000 for several years now. So that's looking good. Next slide. And so here's more information on the coho populations. And I've got to start off by saying that our Corvallis, this information comes from Corvallis Research. There was a little bit that came from Phil when they ran the Neil Creek Weir, but we acknowledged it in the plan and in our reports that it's very difficult to sample populations in the Hood River because of glacial till. We have low numbers of fish returning, and they're very patchy, and they're hard to detect and keep the numbers of surveys actually in rotation. They fall out of rotation after missing so many times, and they try to survey those throughout the coho spawning survey about once every 7 to 10 days. And so you can see here the populations of Hood River coho, and like I said, there was 1 year that I was talking with Phil that his Neil Creek Weir number actually was higher than our Corvallis estimate. So I just wanted to put that forward so you understand that. And you don't have a hatchery program here. I think these are all washougal fish. And then here you can see the harvest rates on coho. They manage harvest rates up to Bonneville Dam. And then we don't know what that harvest rate is between there, but if you think about it, to hit kind of on a recovery, you have to actually fish less than these numbers here. And so they're gonna be exceeded, but that's not a metric that we actually say whether we pass or not for Hood River populations. And occupancy of habitat, that's another interesting one. You can see it's either 50, 75 for the most part, 100 or 0, and that's based upon when you see the survey results come out of Corvallis Research for Hood River populations, it's usually somewhere between 1 and 4 surveys that they're actually able to keep in rotation. And so that's been a problem on our behalf on trying to figure out how to best do that, how to best do this monitoring. I think we're about done. There's a couple more slides. Now here is the habitat restoration piece. I told you I modified those metrics, and you can see this is more of a percentage of the goals that we showed earlier. So large wood was 33% or 33 miles, and based upon what I've been able to record since 2010 to 2020, they're about 37% of the goal. And then you can kind of compare that to some of the other basins if there's an interest. You have the coast strata, the Cascade, and the gorge strata. And Cindy was right, because I don't know if you've actually done some work on off-channel habitat, but we don't have any recorded on that. And then over here on the far side, you can see where the goals were. This side, basically how far we come with the goals. And if you were to, based on this analysis, we should be at this point over a 15-year period. Last slide. And so this is one last slide. So in the recovery plan, there's like 308 actions. And in the Hood, there's, I think, 270 to 308, maybe 38 or so, 39 actions. I wrote that down. And this is just a table that I cut out of that. And the main thing is that of the 39 actions, 35 of the 39 actions have been completed or ongoing. There's a couple that haven't been completed, and these are beyond what you guys would normally focus on, but life cycle monitoring site was one that was recommended. A coho reintroduction program was recommended. Those are all things that, those are ones that haven't been done, but like I said, the important thing is that almost all the actions that were Hood River specific have been addressed or ongoing.
What is the life cycle monitoring site?
Life cycle monitoring site is where you would have the ability to monitor adults in and smolts out in a particular watershed. Say like Neal Creek, if you put a, I wouldn't recommend it, but if you put like a low head dam in with a fish ladder, you could stop everything from going up and going down. Well, you would temporarily stop them and get a count. And so that would be a total understanding of what's going on in one watershed. That's all I had.
Okay.
Thank you.
Questions?
So then nothing gets delisted and we wait another 10 years and do the reporting again?
Nothing will get delisted. You saw, I don't know if you saw NIM's last 5-year status report, or it came out probably 6 months ago and it was like 2 years late. But it said that there was no change or status in the entire, for all the populations across the issue. And so the answer is it won't be delisted tomorrow. I think we've got quite a ways to go. We will continue to evaluate this. And some of the bigger pieces that will come out, I think, is well, one, we're dealing with our chum strategy, which doesn't really affect you guys too much. But we use this to evaluate. And so there has been some changes as a result of some of these actions that were in the plan. And some of the actions were like installing aware at Moving Falls Fish, Moving Falls, and East Fork, which were accomplished. And so I think the biggest piece, and I don't know how this is going to happen, is that we acknowledge some of the actions that we have taken and think about what kind of additional actions we could take that we collectively think might make a difference and add those into the recovery plan. It is a voluntary plan, but we add those in and we keep doing the good work we're doing and continue to investigate our fish populations. And hopefully we continue to have some of these good years like we did last year for coho, and that kind of spreads out across all the populations.
Did I kind of hear you saying that somewhat part of the issue with the charts and all over the place was that the spawning or the observed fish, you know, the times when people would come and do surveys and it wasn't consistent, or did you say they always go to the same place or they do the same?
So
I'm trying to figure that out.
So this is only for the coho population that Corvallis Research does. Everything else has flowed through the Hood River Production Program and their telemetry efforts and stuff like that. But you're right, they don't go to the same place every year. They have what's called a frame. And that's basically, they look at all the area where coho would spawn. And then they try to sample 30% of that area, which is not a lot of area when you look at the limited number of miles in the gorge and the limited numbers of coho miles spawning even in the hood. And so they try to, and then they'll do a random pick over those miles and try to sample 30% of those. And then if they, in the process of doing those, they miss, I don't know how many days. So they, like I said, they go every 7 to 10 days and they'll go out and look and count fish and reds and everything. If they miss a certain interval, I don't know if it's 2 times or 3 times over the course of the spawning season, it gets rejected as a point, as an estimate, because it violates the conditions under which they produce that estimate. And so it's just for coho, it's not for the other species.
Is there a reason coho is treated differently in Corvallis versus the local office?
I don't think it's treated differently. I think it's just the methods they employ. The Hood River Production Program earlier on never picked up coho. And so I think Corvallis Research wanted to, so coho is their most robust data set for the Lower Columbia. They wanted to continue to provide those estimates, partially also because it's a state list. It's the only state listed species we have. And so we had to provide that information on a yearly basis too. And so since the Hood River Production Program never picked it up, they came over here and started doing those surveys, and they just employ a different methodology. I don't know if it's a funding scenario or what, but I think it was kind of a acknowledgement that the Hood River Production Program was not going to get it, and so Corvallis Research would do it. And maybe not put so much burden on the Hood River Production Program, considering that their priorities were steelhead and spring Chinook.
I have a question, and it's sort of a small detail, but it's something that we've just been curious about, even as far as permitting goes. But so in the recovery plan, it says that, of course, the spring Chinook population in the Hood River was extirpated, and then a reintroduction was underway using it out of basin stock, as you mentioned, the Deschutes. But that there is some natural reproduction, and that the origin of those fish isn't known. And so just from how we characterize the wild population of spring Chinook on the Hood River, is it accurate to say that none of those wild fish are a listed stock at this point?
I believe that's the way NOAA is taking
Okay,
this.
that's how we've interpreted
Yeah.
it, but then there's been some, I don't know, it gets mischaracterized. I think from time to time it'll be like ESA listed spring Chinook in the Hood River, but and I think it's easy to confuse just because there are goals laid out in the recovery plan, but
It's been super confusing for us too. You know, and then going through all that master plan stuff, and then, you know, BPA funded, and so you go through their environmental compliance, and right, I think the tribes really tried to make the point like, well, and philosophically, I would say the same thing too. Deschutes is a mid-Columbia ESQ. It is not a lower Columbia. So if you're trying to recover lower Columbia, you shouldn't use mid-Columbia stock. You know, those decisions were made long ago or whatever, but it always kind of was, you know, it always felt a little unfair, not that we were kind of the regulatory burden was imposed on us for spring Chinook when they're not lower Columbia. You know, like anyway, it was always kind of odd, and it was always a difficult management wise.
I understand where you're coming from, and I think we try not to perpetuate that, or try not to perpetuate that when I'm having talks on like Hood River Spring Chinook, and I know our folks, you know, over in out of headquarters are very careful of that to a degree, and we always try to say, all right, this is an unlisted stock, and we recognize that, even though the recovery plan has goals. And, you know, that's something we might address in the recovery plan if we talk about different adaptive management strategies. Because in the recovery plan, you know, we also deal with unlisted stocks that don't need to be recovered in theory on Southwest Washington steelhead, which occur in the coastal drainage. And we also dealt with Clackamas Spring Chinook, even though they're upper Willamette. And so it's just a matter of timing and how we deal with those. And so that might be an opportunity during the public comment period to bring that up.
Early on, they used Carson stock, right, for a few years.
Oh, yeah, but that was the terminal fishery. That was not a reintroduction kind of program, and those faded out. So we did a bunch of genetic work from all the adult trap data with Krifik, Hagerman Genetics Lab, and so you can kind of you can identify sort of population groups through what they call genetic stock identification, or you know, you can genotype like these sort of closely related populations or whatever. And so yeah, you can tell a lower Columbia, you know, lineage from a mid or upper Columbia or snake or whatever. And those Carson fish just really didn't persist like in the population. Like they didn't, there wasn't like Carson stock genetics really present. It really got.
They didn't actually reduce.
No, it was pretty much all Deschutes or, you know, mid-Columbia. And Carson's a total weird stock. It's like a mutt. They actually grab fish out of the fish ladders. It's a real domesticated weird stock, but you know, it was pretty much they all tied to that mid-Columbia Deschutes, which Deschutes stock belongs to, because you know that's what's supposed to get put in the river, you know, on purpose. But also there was an element of a lower Columbia fish there that we hypothesized was fish coming from the Sandy. They looked different genetically. They had some different traits. Later run timing, larger size, which are classic like Sandy River traits. They're known as a late running spring Chinook and a large body size. So that was interesting. And there was hatchery and wild fish both that appeared to show that lower Columbia type, like that Sandy River type, or Clackamas would also fit in that as well. But it was a minority, but nothing showed as like Carson really, or you know, very rarely. So, and that net, we actually tried to do a manuscript on that, and it just never kind of got all the way through the process. But anyway, that's what I recall from that.
So back to what you were saying, Lindsay, is it ODFW's thinking potentially that the Hood River shouldn't characterize the spring Chinook population here as threatened? Because that is sort of a core, I mean, you know.
Right, well, and not as ESA listed.
And mid-Columbia Chinook are not listed. Nope.
So, yeah, I mean, this would be, you know, it's all the documents before I came always characterized it that way.
Right.
So I certainly didn't change that, but is it ODF and, you know, I mean, you guys don't have to speak for your agency right at this moment, but seriously, there should be a distinct change in the technical description of the listing status of spring Chinook.
I think
ODFW should
I think it depends on what agency you talk to.
Well, but ODFW should say something.
Yeah,
you know,
we-
and provide that kind of thing. I mean, Rod was like, you know, Rod's been involved, you know, up until retirement and never said anything about describing it differently. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's a small detail, but it seems to be a detail that would be worth ironing out because we have, as Ryan was alluding to with our permitting, have had to distinguish that we're not handling and dealing with illicit stock of spring Chinook.
Yeah, I mean, so you're Jim, I mean, actually, maybe we need to make a formal request to ODFW to, you know, and change that.
I feel like it's
You know.
NOAA or it's the feds that actually are the ones who are kind of the ones who are insisting or, you know, ones who say they're listed.
I don't know. I mean, you read their 5-year status report and it says it's an unlisted stock.
Yeah.
And so I don't know where all of this is coming from, whether it's different people in the same agency that are not looking at it or different departments within NOAA. I'm not exactly sure of that.
Like I said, I've got different answers from, and I think it's like different documents, you know, like one
Like
group
we've gotten
will
different
say,
answers from NOAA fisheries.
or, yeah, I feel like over the years it's been inconsistent or whatever, or like, so yeah, you look at one recovery plan, or you look at another document in some other place, or, you know, whatever, and it'll list them, or it'll include them, and as I recall, BPA was of the opinion, in their minds, for environmental compliance, they were listed. I've never like got a clear answer. You know, like I haven't.
Do you guys
You're
use,
saying because it was
it-
extinct that this stock that's been reintroduced shouldn't be, it isn't part of the listing.
Right, and it's not actually from that genetic grouping. So,
It's
I guess.
reading what's in the recovery plan, and it's not overly clear, but it says that the Hood River spring Chinook population was extirpated, and that a reintroduction is underway using outer basin stock. And that was, of course, the time that the recovery plan was written. But that there are the progeny of wild fish, and the origin of those fish is unknown. So it sort of implies that there might be other wild fish that are immigrating into the Hood Basin.
yeah, there could be, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
It could be
and
the
that
long lost Hood River
we don't
wild
know,
fish.
you know, what
If you don't
the-
know what the genetics of it.
So yeah, history of this fish is.
If
but-
sandy fish strayed into the Hood River and we knew they were sandy fish, they would be.
Well, yeah, that's the question, which I don't know the answer to.
Well, we're taking, I mean,
But
we're
it's pretty-
investing
yeah.
millions of dollars in for recovering, and, you know, the tribes and everybody, millions to recover spring Chinook. And so it would be very strange to not say that they're threatened in a public facing document that we have, you know, that we do.
Well, I think Cindy.
For a
part of-
grant application, right? I mean, oh, but they're not listed. but
We don't care about
like $1 million to blah, blah, blah.
I think part of the answer to this question may, setting the federal listing aside, spring Chinook and the Hood and the goal to recover a wild, self-sustaining, naturally reproducing population, it's important.
Yeah.
They're a state sensitive species. They're economically important. They're culturally important. You know, the federal listing off to the side,
Right.
they're still a highly important species to work on.
But are they as important as the ones that we still have wild fish in code for? Like, if all the money's going to spring Chinook to try to reintroduce something that's gone, is that same money going to try to save the summer steelhead? Or to save the winter steelhead, that we still do have wild stock that still produce in the river?
And I would argue, Dan, that a
I'm
lot.
just asking questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good one, but I think everything, in my opinion, from being here the past 10 years, everything that we do for spring Chinook benefits, you know, and steelhead, you know, they've got the same, very similar
What you were
distribution.
saying about, okay, now I have to ask for money. And it makes it a lot easier to ask for money when I'm asking for money for a listed species.
Well, you're
you
right,
know.
and we would always be able to say coho and steelhead and, you know, blah, 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 but
And fall Chinook.
Bull trout.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I guess
It's-
that's short.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when it comes to, having to deal with the problem with what you're talking about, like our permitting process, now we're handling the fish that, now we have to behave as if it's a listed fish under these circumstances, and under the other circumstances, we're not behaving like it's a listed fish. So that was my question, like, if we're interested in, if we're interested in the part that makes it difficult because it's not listed, but then we want to gain all the benefits by saying it's listed, where are we falling?
That's the irony to me, is like the fact that they're listed in the ESA makes it harder to do things. It adds more process.
Yeah.
It adds more
I mean-
paperwork,
I said that, Dan, but then I also feel like because of the overlap of habitat, I'm not, in no case do we really ask for $1 million for something that's only going to benefit Spring Chinook. So scratch what I said.
Well, you
I don't
make
think
an
it
important,
diminishes
but-
anything around here.
Yeah,
It's
but
just-
but my
Designation.
question still stands is, should the watershed group in these public facing documents split hairs over something like that?
Maybe just don't talk about the Chinook and just talk about summer steelhead. And say, we're doing everything we're doing here on the watershed for summer steelhead, and it's gonna benefit these guys in spring Chinook too, right?
we can talk
Switch it
about
up, and
that,
that way you definitely are talking about listed fish.
but there's a lot of people think differently about different populations and place different importance on them. And so you can consider that as a potential prioritization metric, but then you have other values that you can also start interjecting. And so I think what Steve was mentioning is that it is important. That's kind of why we have some of these goals that we showed on the spring Chinook, is that we recognize that they're not a listed fish, but yet we want to try to bring those populations up to a more self-sustaining level.
And Judy Fiedler with the Forest Service, she's the ESA person for the Forest, Mount Hood. And so whether spring Chinook is listed under or not under ESA, critical habitat is still designated for that species. Thanks for adding that, Judy.
Yeah, that's a good point. And like, the recovery plan, whether or not it's lower Columbia stock or mid Columbia stock that's used, it's still to achieve recovery in the lower Columbia. You still need a certain amount of populations to, be low risk of extinction, yada, yada. And so the Hood, like you mentioned, there aren't very many spring Chinook populations on there inside. There's the two, so it kind of by default, the Hood has to be included.
Got it. Thanks for that. That's definitely spawned good conversation.
Well, this was kind of contentious for, like, especially a few years ago when we were, kind of doing a lot of the program changes and a lot of those kind of master plan revisions, like I'm talking about like the 2008, before the one, Lindsay and I were just involved in, like kind of the original rewrite. It was like, it got contentious a little bit.
Discussion.
Okay, well, I have to point out that we're 25 minutes over our time,
I
but
think we can
we also started.
Stop the recording. She stopped hours ago.